Welcome to those of you who've just joined us today. I hope you've had a good day. Certainly from what I've been hearing, there's been some really good stuff going on, so I hope that you've gotten something from that and that you enjoy the rest of the day, if you're just here for the day or for the rest of the conference. I'm just going to, before we kick off in the keynote, I'm just going to hand over to Terry Morrissey, our CEO, who is with us a year now, so it's her first year, and I'll hand over to her. Terry?
Thanks, Anne. My first day as the CEO of PSI was exactly this day last year in Galway when I went to the conference. For my first week in the role was at the annual conference, and I spent the week listening to people. And so it's been a very interesting year. But anybody wants to hear more about that, they can buy me a drink later on this evening. I'm very delighted to introduce Peter Saville, Professor Peter Saville. My own background is in, if I'm to call myself anything, we're talking about identity, would be, I suppose, a business psychologist. And Peter doesn't like to have much labels either, but those of you who know about Saville and Holdsworth, Saville, the Wave, Saville Wave, will know of Peter's very long tradition in the whole area of psychology and what he's added to the whole field of understanding of personality and psychometrics, but he doesn't want to be called a psychometrician either. So Peter is also an entrepreneur, a footballer, and we discovered just before we started that we share the same taste in music. So with enough of that, I'm really delighted that Peter can be with us today. So Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. About the football, I'm not anymore. Playing up to 50 with no cartilages is not a good idea. So I've now got 2 new knees for the heart strong. So that's good. Okay, if we could look at the first slide, if we could. The quote I gave is from Master and Commander. I don't know if you saw the film with Russell Crowe in it. It's about a British man of war chasing a larger French man of war across the Pacific to try and take it out, basically, because it was dangerous. It was written by Patrick O'Brien, who adopted an Irish name, and he died in Dublin, apparently. But the quote from the film and the book, Master and Commander, is, "Identity," said Jack, comfortably pouring out more coffee, "is not identity something you are born with. The identity I'm thinking of is something that hovers between a man and the rest of the world." This is the captain speaking. "A midpoint between his or her view of himself and theirs of him or her. But each, of course, affects the other continually. Reciprocal fluxion, sir. There's nothing absolute about this identity of mine." And I think that demonstrates quite nicely the complexity of trying to assess human personality. I think, for example, things like the Big Five are a very good and useful working system for academic work, but there's a lot of evidence that actually personality is more complex than just 5 factors of personality. You can factor it into many more facets than that. But I'll try and put some evidence up for that later. So it demonstrates the elusive concept of dealing with personality. The story's supposed to be based on fact, but actually the captain was actually Spanish, okay, not English. He was in a Spanish man of war, but that's a matter of mere detail when it comes to doing films. Or is it an example of perfidious Albion, which I think is what the French call the English? Don't trust them. I think the Italians have another, talking about identity, another expression, never trust an Englishman with blue eyes. He'll deceive you. Or as an Irish friend of mine once said, Gay Redmond, he said to me once, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It doesn't trust the bastards. But we always enjoyed a pint together when I came over. So that's my British identity put into perspective. Although after Brexit and trumpets of the last few days, I'm not sure whether I'm European, British, English, or as my mother came from the Gower Peninsula, whether I'm Welsh. I think I'm beginning, perhaps I should be Irish, the way things are going at the moment. Throughout history, there's been a burning question. People have asked, what is identity? Where did I come from? Who am I? Of course, identity is defined by many things. Multitude, nationality, one's dress, age, gender, house, parents, or in London, gangs, your postcode. I'm from SC99. Actually, no such postcode exists. But I understand in London gangs, they actually say where they're from, and that tells you how tough they are. So they get their identity from their actual postcode. And of course, there's the question of identity through one's job. When I'm asked, what are you, what do you do? Well, normally it applies for the job that one does. Now, I think that business and occupational psychologists, or what in America they call IO psychologists, in the past have had quite a sort of mixed reception. I read in Time magazine that NASA astronauts hated two things: industrial psychologists and rectal or anal thermometers. When I said this to my wife, she said, "What's wrong with anal thermometers?" But identity as well is what we call personality. Cattell suggested at least three methods to assess a person's identity. One was life data, which actually the 16PF is based upon, not questionnaire data, as you'll find on Wikipedia. It says it was factor analysed. There wasn't a computer big enough in 1940 to take 140 variables that all polls proposed and have 5 people look at them. In fact, that correlation matrix would take 3 years to examine, because we tried to copy it. I had a research assistant try and actually copy what he did with fan tables. There's no computer. That's an enormous number of correlation coefficients to consider. And from that, he came up with 12 so-called primary factors of personality. So it's actually based on ratings of other people. And at the end of the 16PF, it goes Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Well, they're questionnaire data, as he found from self-report, he added later. So there was life data, which is like 360, where you're judging other people. And that was the work laid down by Gordon Allport, okay, when he went from Britain, of course Cattell was British originally, across to America. Then he talked about T data, which is objective test data, and that's where you put someone in a laboratory and you actually observe their behaviour by giving them experiments. For example, you might sit someone down and then suddenly bang a drum behind their back and see how far they jump from the seat. Yeah, that would be a measure of anxiety, perhaps. Whether you could do that sort of thing in selection, I actually doubt. But that's what he meant by objective T data. Example, how much you can withstand pain. It would be how much you could actually hold your hand in freezing cold water, or how much electric shock you could take through going through the system. So he talked about that objective T data as being the best data, but though he never really published much in that area, because clearly the self-report method is so much more easy to gain and so much less costly. You can't really wire up graduates and select them, by observing the galvanic skin response. For when, of course, you're anxious, that's a saline solution, so it conducts electricity more easily as a basis of the polygraph, which is about as useful, if we look at the research, as a compass on the North Pole. It gives about 51, 49% sort of accuracy. So that would be, for him, T data. So where do personality tests come in terms of measuring personality? Can we really judge identity from them? Now, the only way you can really answer that is to look at their correlations with real-life criteria, which is what Cattell said. To how much they actually predict the thing that you want to predict, i.e. their predictive validity. Now, if we go on, this is a list of selection methods. Recently, Frank Schmidt has revised his 1998 paper from his meta-analysis of different selection or assessment methods, I know not all are business industrial psychologists, but many of us are involved in selecting people in the end. And he listed all of these different things like interviews, structured, unstructured, job knowledge, reference checks, IQ or general mental ability, conscientiousness as a personality variable, biographical data, etc. Where would you say were the highest validity measures? Which, if you had to choose 6 or 7, where would you say are high in validity? According to his revision in his paper 2 years ago. Any suggestions? Reference checks? Yeah? Job? What, job tryout? Yeah, okay.
Conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness, yeah, okay. Peer ratings? Okay, well, let's see when he adjusted it for a new correction for restricted range, what he found in his paper 2 years ago. So if we go to the next slide, the highest was general mental ability, with an estimated validity of 0.65. That is enormous. I mean, with a 0.65 validity, you can cut your decision errors down by about 75%. And remember that the payoff of a selection procedure is linear to its validity, not to its square. That's a coefficient determination. That's asking about the common variance. That's a different question. But they've conclusively showed since the time of Brogdon, Cronbach and Glaser, and Frank Schmidt and Hunter, that in fact it's linear to the correlation coefficient and the payoff. So general mental ability came in at 0.65. Then, most surprisingly, he's now saying that unstructured interviews are slightly, it's not much, are slightly more valid than structured interviews. And we were always taught in business psychology that structured interviews were better. But he's saying that in fact they're slightly more valid. Peer ratings, as someone said, they do quite well, 0.49. Job knowledge, 0.48. Integrity test, 0.46. Now, a lot of people sort of knock personality measures as not having validity, but they are personality measures. Integrity tests try and measure honesty, basically, and they come in at 0.46. What's important is that Schmidt actually shows that they add incremental validity to IQ, about the best method of actually adding incremental validity. Then we've got job tryout, someone said. And there is evidence, so you often need about 2 years of experience with someone before you really know them in the job. A few weeks, you could be very deceived about the person's success or not. So they were the higher validity. Then let's go to the next slide, if you can. Mid-range, assessment centres. I remember Mike Smith did a ladder some years ago, and he had assessment centres at the top. But actually, Schmidt is saying that they're coming in at 0.37. They are quite expensive, of course. There used to be 5-day procedures with IBM. It was said that Henry Murray, the great American psychologist, came over from America to help us do them in Britain for the War Office selection boards. Interestingly enough, when Vernon looked at the different assessors, they had psychologists, psychiatrists, and line officers, he looked at who was most valid. The worst judges were the psychiatrists, next worst were the psychologists, and the best were the line officers. Probably because they'd been there. And they had experience of what's required, in terms of that particular need for promotion. Biographical data, gone a bit out of fashion now. Is it used here much, biographical data? Really? You ask about a person's background. If you're selecting cabin staff, you say, have you travelled abroad? If they haven't, they get negative marks, for that. Work sample tests, we always thought they were higher. They're coming in at 0.33. Situational judgment tests, he's added, they're very popular now because they look sexy. And we did one for Land Rover Jaguar when I was Savile Consulting, and they had to actually answer questions how they would lay out the actual dashboard of a Jaguar. And it started up with the engine and so on. But what it did do was attract a lot of good candidates in engineering. because it looked good. And that's one thing that Schmidt doesn't consider in his work, is the attractiveness of the selection procedure. Because as we shall see, that can have a distinct effect upon the cost-benefit or utility of the procedure. It's no good having a good procedure that people, which is valid, don't like. And that's one problem with IQ tests. You try and use them in the USA, you'll get sued because of racial differences. So many organisations have dropped IQ tests across America because they're frightened of being sued. Some have even gone to random selection because they're so fed up with being sued, they're doing it by ballot. It doesn't add up to improved staff selection, I'm afraid, but they've just literally done it by ballot rather than actually use a method like IQ. It works, but basically they're worried about racial differences that you find, although those differences are getting smaller. In Britain, in black groups, they're actually gaining, as we become second and third generation, the differences are getting lesser. Reference checks. 0.26. One problem with reference checks is, of course, many organisations won't give you one in case they're sued. Xerox, for example, some years ago, one line manager made very negative comments about a person going to another job. He challenged it in court, and they couldn't justify it. I think he got a lot of money for defamation of character. So now many companies will say they started then, they did this job, and they left then, and they won't make any personality assassination. Some do them by telephone to try and get more information that way, if they possibly can. So reference checks 0.26. Then we go to the next slide, low validity. Emotional intelligence, despite the fact it's, as a construct, not much liked by psychologists, comes in at 0.24. Conscientiousness, 0.22. Note, however, that conscientiousness does add variance to IQ. It's unique variance, while some of the other methods with high validity don't add very much. Job experience, 0.13, so really getting quite low now. Person, organisation, fit measures, emotional stability, interests. Look at that, years of education, 0.1. Graphology and astrology, basically about 0 in terms of it. There's one thing you can tell from graphology, above chance, it's been shown in psychology, and that is, believe it or not, the gender or sex of the writer. People can tell about 70% to 30% whether it's male or female. But there are easier ways of measuring that. Graphologists always deny it, but it's quite simple undergrad study to do. And they can judge above chance for some reason. Women tend to be neater and faster in their writing. The question also arises about the use of these techniques. Lee Cronbach, who wrote Essentials of Psychological Testing, which I think is the best book in testing that's around, it's been through many editions now, he did one paper and he looked at different selection scenarios. And he said, well, let's say that we actually top-down selection, using tests of general mental ability, what would be the likely output gain? Making reasonable assumptions, he found about a 13-14% increase in production or output. That's considerable. If you're in production as a director and you could get 13% from a 20-minute test, output increase, that's not to be sniffed at. When you did top-down in different racial groups, i.e. a quota system, which many people don't like, he found that in top-down in different groups, you still got a 10% gain. However, if you had a low cutoff, let's say the 25th percentile, and selected randomly above that, the return was only 3%. So he's basically saying, if you put in low standards, you won't get the gain that you will if you have higher standards. To that extent, there are a number of Dutch psychologists that have actually pointed out that there can be a bit of a conflict between equal opportunity, EO legislation, and actually output, i.e. efficiency, which is really rather unfortunate. Though, as I said, the differences are getting less. And interestingly, on measures of things like conscientiousness, Frank Landy, who's a litigation psychologist in America, he actually would say that that doesn't show differences between racial groups, and that can help to water down the differences that you'll find in general mental ability. So he always advised that you did use that variable, so you water down to some degree any differences that you may have. Okay, go to the next point. Let's go then to the question of, this is from the Battle of Jutland, okay, when I think in the First World War our ships were being sunk all over the place, and it was made by an admiral saying there's something bloody wrong with our ships today. But there's a lot of criticism about the questionnaire. I don't think with a questionnaire you get as hard data as you do with tests of numeracy, verbal ability and so on. There's clearly more subjectivity in the ratings that people use about themselves, and they are prone to more sources of error. We can move on. Now, there's a little equation for you. This is known as the cost-benefit equation. There is a paper called or utility equation, a paper called the futility of utility analysis. That is that when this was put up, it turned line managers right off. But it's actually not that complicated. What it's saying is that the dollar or euro return equals the validity of the method as a correlation coefficient. So ideally that will be +1, which you never get, because people are not machines. Even machines aren't perfectly reliable, but it will be +1. So the higher the validity that we saw in that table, like 0.6 for GMA, the better. If the validity is 0, then it all goes to 0. Next, the average Z-score of the person you recruit. How many SDs above average is the people that accept your offer and stays? So, if in fact you can recruit on average people at the 85th percentile, assuming a normal distribution, the Z-score will be +1. What you don't want is the Z-score to be 0. That's the mean. So if you only take average people, that will go to 0 even if RV is high. So one can't really just consider the actual correlation coefficient with job performance, but consider how successful you are in attracting good talent and retaining it. If in fact you're forced to take people who are breathing, and that's all, then your Z-score of the mean Z-score of the people you take on will be low. What you want are high Z-scorers with good validity. Next is the difficult part. SDY is the difference between an average and an above average performer in the job. What do they produce in output? And that's produced a lot of papers trying to estimate what that value is. Hunter and Schmidt actually found in the public sector, in lower level jobs, about 40% of salary. So that if they were actually earning 40,000 euros a year, the SDY was about 16,000 euros. As jobs get more, however, complex, SDY gets bigger. So if you're dealing with a marketing director, the difference between an average one and 85th percentile performer one is probably more than 40% of their salary. My son runs an IT company called Brightstar. We do very specialised websites, quite complex ones here and in the States. And I said to him, what's the difference between an average developer and a really exceptional one? And he said, Dad, it's almost infinite. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the really top developers can do things that the average one can't do. And they're called 10x programmers. They come in for a particular problem, solve the problem, they don't want to manage anybody, and they walk out with a very big bonus. And he said that they are so brilliant, they can actually break the code, do it this way or that way, and our average guys just can't do that. So he said that the SDY is enormous in some aspects of IT. Then you multiply by the number of people you take on. Finally, you've got a cost. What is the cost of the procedure? Well, the cost of assessment centres, if it's 5 days, quite high, but now they're going often to 1 day and 3 day assessment centres. It must be said, though, of course, assessment centres can be quite good for development purposes, not just for selection. So, looking at that particular equation, what you want is high validity, high performers accepting your offers, and you don't want to leave within 2 weeks of taking them on. It's got to be for important jobs, and if you're a big organisation, you're going to take on a lot of them. and then you've got to consider what the cost is. When Crumbach and Glaser looked at cost in psychological tests and personnel decisions, they said if you get any gain, the cost almost disappears. You know, the cost of a few €100 of using a personality and ability test is so minor against the gain that it virtually disappears as a factor, in their opinion. Because the gains are so massive if you can get 0.6 sort of validity. I mean, even a 0.3 validity can cut your errors by half. If you, say, get 4 or 5 applicants per post, you can show that with an expectancy table. Okay, if we move on. What about the methods of constructing questionnaires? Well, Birsch, it's a German psychologist, wrote a very good paper way back in 1984, where he looked at different methods of construction and then considered in a literature review which ones work best. First, there's empirically keyed. They're not much used now. I mean, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, was developed in the 40s. It's been revised now by Butcher. I shared, in fact, a one-day session with him at PSYOP some years ago, because they want to use the MMPI more in personnel selection. In the UK, I hardly know anybody that uses it. It's for psychiatric diagnosis. Does anybody here use it? You do? So it's 1, 2. Yeah? How do you find it? Yeah, it's 300, 500, is it? Questions. It's a short version and a longer version, isn't it? It's 567 questions. Yeah. How do you...
Vague, but clinically useful.
Clinically useful, yeah. Yeah. It's been sued enormously in America because they tried to use it in job selection. Target stores actually were sued, and it went to the Supreme Court, and basically because of the question content, it was actually said that asking people about their bowel movements wasn't particularly relevant to being a security guard, and they, in a class action, they all got a couple of thousand, $100,000 each. Oh, it has got questions like that in it, hasn't it? About some bowel movements and other such things. They tried to remove some of it in Bush's revision, but there's still some quite unusual questions in there. Then there's the inductive, which is often based on factor analysis, like the 16PF, where it's claimed, but actually it was done by eye. It wasn't done by factor analysis, it was done by eye, by 5 other people Cattell doesn't name. You go back to the 1940 paper, it's got in the literature that he did it by factor or cluster analysis. No, it was 5 people he doesn't name. He said he looked at this matrix. That matrix was 140 variables. 140 times 140, right? Divide that by 2, minus 140 is the number of correlation coefficients. I think that's nearly 10,000. Now, if you spent, let's say a minute looking at each correlation coefficient against every other, that's a long time to be doing it. So then, of course, the most famous is the Big Five of personality, which came in on the scene really in the early 1980s. So that's inductive, where you're trying to get a parsimonious solution. Then there's a deductive, based on some sort of theory, that is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is one of the most popular tests used, I think, but not technically in selection. I mean, the authors are very much against it being used in selection, but it is used in selection, and used in development. We looked at, there are criticisms of its constructability. The extroversion-introversion scale looks okay, but things like thinking and feeling, I with Rad McKeever, we separated thinking and feeling. They therefore should be opposites. They correlated plus 0.6 and a correlation of 1,000. So people who think also feel. They're not opposites. If you think about it, that makes some sense. So if you think, you're more likely to feel. The thing about it is, of course, that with 16 types, it says nice things about everybody. So you've got no fight on your hand. So I'm sure it can be used well. But there's no predictive validity information in the manual at all. If you go through it, because that's the sort of thing I like to do. Sad, aren't I? Yeah? But go through the manual and just look for the actual validity data. And that's why they say it was designed by mother and daughter for careers advice in high school in America. And it took off in about 1970s, 1980s here in the UK. The OPQ, I developed that at Savile and Holdsworth with a team with Jill Nyfield, Roger Holdsworth, Bill Maybe, Lisa Cramp. We never claimed that that was factor analytically pure. We defined personality as being a person's typical way of behaving, and we said that there were 3 divisions, which was in a sense their people or behaviour skills, thinking skills and feelings. So that was just a conceptual way of breaking down personality. We also produced a 14-factor version, which is known as the factor version, which is based on factor analysis, an 8-factor version called Octagon, and a 5-factor version, which was really the Big Five. That was back in 1984. I didn't know that in my PhD in 1977, when I factor analysed the 16PF, Dr. Rainer Kurtz came running into my office one day and said, I've seen your PhD, your factor analysis there in 1978, 77, 78, there's the Big Five. It's actually gone into the 5 factors, which later came on with the NEO and other such questionnaires. Then there's the validity-centric, and with the WAVE questionnaire, what we did is we had a model, but we actually got ratings of people on those variables, yeah? With the use of a computer, that wouldn't have been possible 20, 30 years ago, and we chose the items which were one reviewed internationally, but also predicted best outside criteria. So we actually had validity data as we constructed the test itself, rather than being based on some sort of just ideas alone. So we could choose the best items, not just in terms of reliability, but validity. We can move on. Now these are the sorts of questions that caused, the comment by Dick Buzzard. Or was it Dick Buzzard? No, I think it was one British psychologist said about personality questionnaires, they may be all right, but they seem to me to overestimate a person's self-knowledge and underestimate their sense of humour. and these are examples from actual questionnaires going in the 70s and 80s and still are around today. I'd rather be a colonel than a bishop. That measures premisia, according to Cattell. Factor I, whether you're tough or tender-minded, shows massive gender differences. That factor I. Another question is, I'd like to be an engineer. I would be rather more likely to admire the beauty of a poem than a well-made gun. That's also factor I, the 16PF. The thing is, that we psychologists are often very interested in the theory behind the test, but we don't often go back to the items and have a look at what actually loads on those items on that particular scale, because that's what defines it. You do get some shocks when you actually go back to the items themselves with a key and check it backwards. More than 50% of Americans kiss on their first date. This is from the motivational analysis test. This is a measure of mating urge, apparently. The sight of puffs no longer disgusts me. There is very little love or companionship in my family. I believe in the second coming of Christ. Well, that clearly is going to be unacceptable now with different racial groups. There is something wrong with my sex organs, which must be the classic of all time. There are others. A very good measure is the Edwards Personal Preference Schedule, which is ipsative in pairs, based on Murray's system of needs. And Murray was a very good psychologist, developing the first assessment centres. And because he had a variable of sexual, drive in it, you got some rather odd questions, like I'd rather keep my desk neat and tidy than kiss a member of the opposite sex. And you wonder what question's coming next, actually. So people used to take out those questions, but that ruined the whole structure of the questionnaire. But he had measures of need achievement, within that scale, which wasn't in the 16PF, for example. But the problem was, with the changing, of EO legislation, it was not acceptable to put those sort of questions in. Okay, let's move on. what have we learnt about trying to improve, test items in questionnaires? Well, actually, there's a good deal of evidence that short questions work better than long ones. There's about a -0.4 correlation between the number of items or words in an item and how well it correlates with the scale it's supposed to measure with. So keep them short. Avoid the double-barreled, like, I am a nervous person who shows my feelings, 2 questions. And market researchers are very, very quick to actually say avoid the word and, or, etc., because you make it into 2 questions. I might be nervous, but I might not show it. Words like always and never, try to avoid those, because you can't really say I never. And they're normally lie questions, basically. I never lie, or whatever. You can pick them out relatively easily. You can reduce social desirability. That's one question, of course, that one has to address, that people do project themselves in, a favourable light. Paulus talked about factor alpha and factor gamma. One is outright lying, impression management it's called. Yeah? The other is actually not conscious, but the tendency for us to project ourselves favourably. When I gave the OPQ to Richard Branson, he was STEM 10 on social desirability. But he wasn't lying, I'm sure. He's just got a very favourable self-image. And it actually correlates with actually sales success and things of that kind. So you do have the problem with questionnaires that people, do tend to actually do that, but that is almost part of their personality, if you understand what I'm trying to say. There's evidence actually that people who are actually very negative in their self-perception are more likely to suffer from depression, for example. Those with very rosy self-image, although they may be slightly less intelligent, seem to be better adjusted. So a complex variable. Try and rate them age and gender neutral. Avoid idioms for cultural acceptability. And the best way to do that is to, in developing WAVE, we put it across 60 countries virtually, and asked whether they could be translated. If they kept short, so you avoid idioms, you normally can. We did have problems with the OPQ. For example, one of the questions which I wrote in the concept model, which they've given a new name now, OPQ 32, or R or whatever, was I like beating the opposition. In China, they took that literally. So I said, being competitive, they could understand that. Try and keep them behavioural, about what people actually do. And of course, relevant to the purpose. And the problem with MMPI, that in clinical work, I'm sure it's fine, but of course, in many aspects of business psychology, you're going to be in trouble, because people are going to start to object to those sorts of questions, especially, and you end up in a lawsuit. In fact, what we did with WAVE was make a distinction between motive and talent. So we asked what a person was good at and what they felt they would like to be. And we did find on some variables there's a difference between the two. What I'd like to be versus what I'm good at. Although what I feel I'm good at was more valid than what I'd like to be. I remember one of our tutors was quite young, and she was running a course, and she was saying to people, well, come on, let's think of a motive-talent split, which is what we called them, about what I'm good at versus what I like. And it was a shame, really. It was our first course that they'd run on their own, and a guy put his hand up. He said, I can think of one, a motive. He said, I like sex, but I'm not very good at it. She was absolutely red and embarrassing. But we found that the actual items which were about talent tend to predict a bit better than actually what they'd like to be. And actually, Birch did a lot of research and actually found that actually you don't need 20 or 30 questions per scale for good validity. In fact, if you go beyond 6, he found the validity went down. I can refer you to that literature if you like. Perhaps people get bored. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And in selection now, when you're delivering tests by internet, you can observe how people drop out the selection procedure for a long test. For each page they've got to turn over. They expect to do it quickly. perhaps on an iPhone, rather than sit them down, as we used to for a whole day of testing. So really, if you choose your items well and write them well, he actually showed that about 6 items perform better than 30 item scales, which turns the Spearman-Brown prophecy formula upside down, because we always thought the longer the questions, the better. No, he says you write them well, about 6 is fine. So you can write short scales as long as you write them very carefully and don't have ambiguity in them. Okay, move on. Then there's a controversial question of how you present items. You can have forced choice, as in the Eynsync personality inventory, say yes, no, trying to avoid social desirability responding. That often frustrates people. I've seen people put an answer in the middle, even though there isn't a middle response. So it's yes, no. That forced choice is different from ipsative. They're often confused, but in fact, forced choice is where there's yes, no, and there's no interconnection between the items. Then there's the typical Likert scale, which usually is 5-point and goes from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The problem there is, in fact, that I think Cronbach distinguished 13 different types of bias in that type of item. Social desirability, the other major one is central tendency. Some people use the middle and some use the extremes. I did have, actually, he was actually a major general, right, do the OPQ for me, and he never used the 1s and 5s. He never used strongly agree and strongly disagree. He only used agree and disagree. So his profile was flat. So I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, I either agree or disagree. I don't have to strongly agree, strongly disagree. But if you want to call my agree, strongly disagree, you can. If you want to call that, you can. So we did, and his profile went like that, opened up. So how you instruct the person to do the questionnaire makes a difference. And some people say, well, I'm just going to use the middle responses. And other people, like Branson, there were 1s and 5s all over the place. But with him, perhaps he's a more cautious personality, he was only using it as a 3-point scale, not a 5-point scale. Then you've got ipsative, where you have rankings. I was once accused of cheating at patients for using those. In fact, I wrote a paper with Eric Wilson, who was a protege of Sir Maurice Kendall, who produced the Tau statistic, who's a fellow of the Royal Society, actually a brilliant mathematician. Eric Wilson worked in market research, and he said we often use rankings, we can compare, because with normative questions, we find that in Northern Europe, they tend to use the middle response much more in Southern Europe. So when we compare across countries, we've got a major problem with that. So, and also, we've got 3 quality cars, like a Porsche, Mercedes, I don't know, Aston Martin or something. If you ask them, do you like them, they say yes to everything. So you might say, well, rank them in terms of what you're most likely to buy. And we then get better data, because they're forced to choose. So we actually did a Monte Carlo study, and we actually showed with 32 variables, he did the Monte Carlo study, that we produced pseudo-respondents with true scores, which we established. We put in Likert 5-point answers, and we put in rankings in groups of 4, and they both worked about the same in measuring true scores. When, however, we introduced some central tendency bias, the ipsative measures actually correlated better than the true scores than the Likert scales did. I then did a study within that paper on real people, and we found the ipsative measures correlated as high as 0.7 with external ratings, as indeed the Likert Likert format did. They were about the same. More recently, it's Salgado in Spain, who's a very clever psychometrician, has conducted with Neil Anderson and others a meta-analysis, and they found that quasi-ipsative, where you combine normative and ipsative together, actually predicted better than Likert scales. And he said this is going to set the world alight, basically, because in America they won't accept ipsative scales. But he said we actually got highest validity when they were quasi-ipsative. an IPSID measure is defined that the sum of the raw scores is a constant for all people. That's an IPSID measure. So the fourth choice, it doesn't necessarily have to be IPSID. It may not be a constant. But when they are not a constant, but presented as rankings, they found on the big five, they got the best validity of all. That's in the literature in the last 2 years or so. So it seems to be the case that, in fact, because of each method had its own problems, and if you combine them, you get a better measure than using either alone. Okay, next point. So, normative items are not absolutes. Cronbach writes that normatives are subject to 10 or more, I said 13, sources of bias, the social desirability and central tendency. I mentioned a paper that I did with Wilson, with a Monte Carlo study, that IPSID scores correlated better with true scores. I've got a copy of that paper here, by the way, in a book, if anybody wants to see it. When repeated with real respondents, both normative and IPSID format showed very high validity against external criteria, as high as 0.7 or more. More recently, Salgado and Anderson showed that IPSID measures significantly outperformed the normative in terms of validity, so rocking the establishment. So ranking scales can work, it would appear. But remember, we did deal with 32 variables. But then again, they only dealt with 5, and then we're still finding that ranking methods could work well. But I've written more normative scales in my life than I've written IPSID ones. So when we developed the OPQ, it was a trial to see whether the IPSID was more difficult to fake. That was the point. Next point. This is a study we did on WAVE. Neil Schmidt, you see, he's corrected data from a publication in 1998. And therefore, the actual studies he looked at go back even 20, 30 years before that. So the data's getting quite old now. That's not to knock Frank Schmidt, he's a genius. He should get a Nobel Prize for his work in meta-analysis. But one problem with meta-analysis, we are getting different results all over the place. Medics particularly are complaining. Because people correct by different amounts, they're called hydraulics, a restricted range, and unreliability in the criterion and so on. So we need a standard really in terms of meta-analysis, because one needs to go into each study and see what the person has done in correcting for different artifacts within the data. But when we actually looked at the OPQ, the Saville personality questionnaire was a 15-minute, about a 12 to 15-minute version of the OPQ, because people said that you couldn't possibly measure over 100 variables in WAVE in something like 40 minutes. So we said, all right, that's a challenge. We'll take the OPQ, and we'll rewrite the items, and we bet you we can do it in about 12 minutes. So we did it as a bit of research. And that came out with abilities about 0.3. The Hogan, it was similar, 0.3. 16PF was similar. Neo was a bit higher. Wave Focus and Professional Styles were approaching 0.5. We actually used the criterion laid down by Dave Bartram of SHL, not our own criterion. So we didn't bias it to our own outcome. But of course, we had the advantage of developing the OPQ and learning from that and developing WAVE. A considerable advantage, which we didn't have the internet in 1980 that we've got now. Okay, next point. So how do you control faking? Ziegler produced this book. These are educational testing services. It's about that thick, about how you actually stop distortion, because that is a major problem. After about 500 pages, they come to the conclusion that the best thing to do is to have a verifying interview on the results. That's what it comes down to. There is no way of stopping someone faking any more than you can in a court of law. If someone lies, you've got to look for a pattern and basically look for other data. So he says in the end, a verifying interview, which we often do in feedback, is a way to actually say, well, you tell me that you're very extroverted, tell me about the ways you behave X, Y, Z. So it was quite interesting that in this particular paper, book, there's many, many chapters in it, and really writing subtle questions doesn't work. If you write odd questions, you'll get odd results. If you ask behavioural questions, you can actually interview on those and ask the person about them. And if you tell people beforehand that you will give that feedback, one, they value it, and two, and that matters, that they respect that, and they often want to know the feedback. And they think that the questionnaire is cleverer than it really is. But it gives you the opportunity as well to verify what they're actually saying about themselves. In my experience, they tend to elaborate a bit, not tell out and out lies. Because you can say, okay, you say you're 10 on outgoing. Why has you said nothing, for an hour in a group activity? Tell me more about that. Okay, next slide. So, as I said, after much research, it's a verifying interview works best. I've mentioned a point about many candidates think they're much cleverer questionnaires than they actually are. Asking silly questions is not the answer. There's nothing which is an unfakeable. Theresa May is talking about reintroducing 11 plus and saying that she's going to get tests which are uncoachable. There is no such thing. There is no human behaviour you can't coach to increase. One thing to do is guess. Look at it and say that and that don't apply, so I'll guess that one. So there is no such thing as an 11 plus test which can't be actually improved over a few example papers. Of course, it's not only questionnaires which are subject to distortion, but so interviews and CVs. I saw one stat that something like 75% of CVs have errors of fact in them. So they need to be verified as well. So it's a very good idea, of course, to ask the person to bring along their certificates to prove they got this degree or not, because many organisations don't actually do that. And there are people out there that actually don't have the degrees. I remember very quickly I was in South Africa talking to our South African agent, and he had a new partner, and he said he got his PhD on PTSD in Brazil. Okay? And when I left, I said, obrigado. He said, pardon? I said, obrigado. He said, pardon? I said, obrigado. I said, pardon. I turned around and said, he's not been in Brazil. He doesn't know what thank you is in Portuguese. He hadn't. You can pay a couple of $1,000s and get a PhD from Brazil. So I told my Portuguese friends, they laughed, because they know that's the situation. So he was Canadian, but he'd gone down to Brazil to get his PhD. But he didn't know, even my bad pronunciation, of Portuguese. So it's not only questionnaires, of course, but CVs as well. We're now increasingly open to distortion. So conclusions. Much of Frank Schmidt's data now is relatively old. He's corrected it from 1998, and some of those go back 40 years, it must be said. The validity coefficient is not the only thing to be considered. If you've got an attractive selection procedure, and you attract better candidates from it, although the validity is lower, you might get better return. So you must also consider the standard of people you can recruit. And if the actual procedure looks sexy and is branding the organisation, it may well be that people who rejected you before actually accept you, because the top performers can often choose between organisations. So yes, we need high validity, but we need legal and also attractive selection procedures as well. With personality questionnaires, use job relevant variables, avoid stupid questions. We ought to improve our item writing, because some of it is atrocious. Market researchers are better than we are at writing items. Facets seem to predict better than the big five. Dudley et al. Showed that actually the conscientiousness is two factors. One is achieving, the other one's detail conscious. They're very different things. And really, perhaps personality traits are less generalisable than IQ. In one study we did there, across two different organisations, personality questionnaires were better at measuring competencies like leadership, creativity, etc., than just overall job performance. So probably one needs a job analysis more than IQ tests, which seem to generalise perhaps more than is true of personality. So we actually looked at the OPQ in two organisations with similar criteria at different times, one Ipsos, one normative, but the same variables were coming up against similar job performance criteria, you follow me? But they were different. So for measuring whether a person is creative, it was things like innovative and conceptual, which were actually correlating with that. Whereas, perhaps in air traffic control, creativity is a relatively bad idea. Okay? I think I end there, because the time is up, and put it to any questions. You must disagree with something.
I kind of disagree with something, but it was very informative, thanks. I suppose one of the things that...
Can you hear
sorry, should I shout?
Sorry, can somebody...
It's genuine questions. When you were talking about the ipsative user test, one of the things that struck me there was that what you're really talking about is, it seems to me, is Cliff's sort of ordinal measurement theory. And I wondered whether that was something that you had used with that data, because it seems to me that...
No, we just took the measurable scores because...
But if you use the standard PSI, because you mentioned Kendall, and obviously Kendall's tau is the way to go with rank order data.
Yeah.
But is that directly comparable then with the PSI?
Well, it seems that when you've got... Well, we started with 32 variables. So when you've got as many as 32, Dave Bartram looked at this as well.
Yeah.
It's when you get about 16, you've got sufficient degrees of freedom. And in fact, when you compare anyway with Likert items, you can't compare directly with them either. So, we just found they performed as well. Recently, Salgado said that if they quasi-ipsative, so they don't add to a constant, then in that case they outperform the Likert. More research needs to be done. But he did say, I spoke to him on the phone, and I saw that, and he said, no, what you said back in 1990, we've done on Big Five, and it really is quite surprising that Ipsos scales with even 5 variables come out quite well.
Yeah, I suppose.
Woodworth, in experimental psychology, actually was of course pointing out as well that the issues of integral ordinal ratio scales in psychology is all very difficult because we think about temperature, and one observer said, well, when we take temperature, is a difference of 0 to 5 degrees centigrade the same as, say, 27 to 32 degrees centigrade? He said, probably not, in terms of the effect it has.
No, I completely agree. I just think my point is really about there is actually a technology now, a testing technology that Norman Cliff put forward, which is based on dominance matrices. Sorry. Which probably is the bridge between that ipsative and normative sort of argument, I think, to some extent.
Yeah.
Because I think so. I'm just curious to know whether you used that.
I haven't used that. I'd be interested in looking at that. I haven't used that. I think that I personally feel that a lot more attention needs to go into the items, because when you look at many of the items, they're so double-barreled in many questionnaires.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the argument of ipsative normative almost is secondary to getting your items right in the first place, as much as their presentation. But we psychologists like to get into theory. Market researchers, are often quite expert on writing items very, very well. Lastly, there's in market research, there's a story about 2 priests that are arguing about whether it's a sin to smoke and pray at the same time. And they argue, so they say, well, we'll go back to our superiors and were asked whether it's a sin to smoke and pray at the same time. They come back, and one says to the other, well, what did your superior say? He said, well, it was a sin. And the other one said, well, that's funny, because mine said it wasn't. It was okay. So you say it's a sin. What did you ask your superior? I asked whether it was a sin to smoke while praying. The other one said, I asked whether it was a sin to pray while smoking. So how you phrase the question can make a hell of a lot of difference to the response one might get, as they know in politics. Get the question yes, the answer yes on the referendum, to be the one that you want. Because people say yes more often than say no.
Any other questions?
Frank has always taken the view that he did not go through the quality of the studies. He said it will come out in the wash. And he's been criticised for that, but he's always viewed, well, everyone will have a bad study, a good study, you just put them all together with Hunter. Some say he should have looked at the quality and put them in. Now, if there's been a lack of integrity, let's put it, in a given area, and the studies aren't so good, it could well be that certain of those variables which are high are not as high. Now, can I just say, with the integrity testing market, which has come out high in validity, I once met a company owned by Maxwell, who died off of Tenerife, threw himself off the back of his yacht. I won't name the company, and I said to them, you claim validity is as high as 0.7, 0.8. I said, that's unbelievable. If you get 0.3, we're pleased, let alone 0.7, 0.8. What do you mean by validity? Well, he said, we give the actual integrity test, right? So that's a measure. Then we say to them, are you honest? I said, well, that's a reliability figure, not actually a validity figure at all. So that I would just discount immediately. So if that's in the literature, then it's going to inflate that particular method.
And also, it must depend on who's doing the interview.
It probably does, it does. But as I said, the only way we can do it is go through every study that Hunter and Schmidt took on unstructured interviews and studied them in depth. Because I don't know many studies on unstructured interviews in the literature. Because very often, they won't publish them. You've also got the file drawer effect, that where studies show no correlation, they tend not to be published. So that also biases meta-analysis. So that will inflate it. So if it's an interesting method, it will get, and you show validity, they accept it. If you go back and say there was no correlation, they generally say, we're not going to publish it.
Okay. I'm just conscious of the time, but Peter, I'm sure you're around. Will you be happy for people to ask you questions?
Of course.
One-on-one?
One final one at the back.
Okay.
I'd be interested in your thoughts in randomising test items.
Yes, we've done that with IRT. And when I was at I started my career at the National Foundation for Educational Research. They used Rasch scaling then, and they got badly attacked from it. But there are versions now of IRT that we have used. They are very expensive to develop, those banks. They don't stop the problem of cheating, because if you've got a clever cousin over your shoulder telling you the answer, and you can't see them, and you sent the test remotely, in China, for example, they have controlled testing centres where you have to turn up with your passport and actually have your fingerprints taken to actually prove it's you. So we have used item banks for ability tests. They seem to be popular in HR, but it really doesn't get around the problem entirely, because if you've got a maths grad behind you, the fact that it's 2 + 3 versus 3 + 4, won't stop him or her telling you the correct answer. So we certainly did do IRT work because it was much in demand by customers, though very expensive. I think it helps to some degree, but what we always did with ability tests is say, okay, you'll be selected in, but when in fact you come to the final selection interview, you'll be given a controlled test supervised. And that seemed to cut down cheating a lot. And if they came along and they were 99th percentile on the internet test, but the first percentile on the pencil and paper test, or it computer administered by a supervisor, we'd ask them about that.
Thanks for that.
Peter, thank you. Peter, just thank you so much for today.